Test 1 2. Testing 1 2 1 2. Test in the hall. Can you hear me? Yes. Check 1 2 1 2. Check check check. Test 1 2. Okay.
How are you? How are you? Do you get nervous?
No, I just heard. I'm in a little bit of.
Oh, shoot.
I'm okay though. Don't worry about me. It'll be fast. I'm okay. No, don't worry. No, usually if it's okay, I'll stand and just talk up here.
Yeah.
And then we'll both sit down.
Yeah.
So you can sit.
No, I'm going to sit in the front row. And maybe they'll give us some seat.
We do have a seat.
Oh, perfect. Okay.
Somewhere there. Or if not, Sylvia's mine.
Yeah.
No, you're right next to me, right?
That's fine. Did you relax a little today?
Yeah, Sylvia took a walk.
Are you going to make it to the dinner tonight? They're really excited you're coming. You'll force yourself.
What I might do is go home with Sylvia first and change and not go to the middle dinner. You can help me with that. Just say it's got to be bad. She's got to get me.
It's going to be, yeah, good idea. I think that's it.
Isn't it?
Oh, is it? Oh. It's 7, yes, but I told them I might not be there till 8. But if you, so you can get there anytime you want. Because I will be
Yeah, but
here.
you're going by 7:30.
I think that's an excellent idea. And you can just, and I'll say to him, you know what, it's really difficult. And he doesn't, they don't even know about his career afterwards. So. Perfect.
Trying to, on these things, usually I try to really get somewhere, not just, not just give a standard thing, but I think while I'm speaking.
I know, I've witnessed it in your talks.
But yeah, because of the harm, I hope that just occasionally, it won't be horrible or anything, but occasionally it just doesn't happen.
Do you want me to say something
But
in my introduction? Do you want me to say, despite the fact that he has a broken scapula, he is here today. He's all right, but if he winces every once in a while, you'll know why.
Yeah, so maybe so they don't think I got a bad arm or something. I took this
I'm happy to
off.
say that.
I took the thing off just because I thought it would really be.
Yeah. Would you like me to say that?
Maybe just a little bit.
Okay. Okay. I'll just, and I might mention, if you see him wince a little bit, he's here with a broken scapula. Is it called scapula? Scapula. And so he might wince. Won't be about you.
Well, I have a thing that I want to do. I don't know if I can do it in a half hour, so I'm going to try. I don't even know if I can do it. You know what I mean? But it's something that I haven't talked about before or something. I mean, I've talked about some of the sculptures before and some of the ideas before. Just trying to understand a little bit more and paying too blind how to get to this subject. But better to...
So that's the other thing. You know, they're so strict about the time, but I think you should just do whatever the hell it is that you want to do. I want to keep this next to you. And if you want me to, I'll give you a half an hour, a signal at the half an hour mark.
Yeah, I'll have my
And then you can do what
That's perfect. I want talks, I want the questions and stuff. And I kind of gauged it with the slides so that well, there's a lot, but I'm going to move through them fast because I just want
I don't know what you're going to talk about, so I
you
just
don't need
made
a
it.
title.
No. So I was going to ask you about the whole notion of unpossessible, maybe, or matter of factness of the. Okay, good. All right.
Because I'm better to just like
Respond.
respond.
React. Yeah.
You could ask me about some gold. I have some good, not dirty, just really interesting classical stuff.
That's going to be my last question. Yeah. Cool. All right, I'm going to let you collect yourself.
Do we need to get a mic or something? No.
Oh, he's here.
Do we need a mic?
Get you wired up. Alright. So as you may recall, this goes on your left ear.
Can you do all that?
Sure.
Do my glasses all?
So it's on, you don't have to do anything I control when we get back. But we want to make sure that this doesn't go in a pocket or get it like all bound up. We can put this on your belt. That'd be the ideal spot.
Wherever you want.
Okay. Alright, and then if it's not too uncomfortable, it would be great if this can go behind your back. Kind of like that, just for photography purposes. It's a little cleaner looking. Being weird. Yeah. This is making it worse. And that should be that. Somebody will be introducing you, and then chances are they won't remember to move this, but if you just bend it down.
Oh,
Okay, that's perfect.
but I'll bend it down.
Okay. And then I control everything in the back. You don't have to worry about that.
Thank you.
Uh-huh.
Welcome. Welcome to the annual National Council program and celebration. You, as a member of the National Council, are very important to Anderson Ranch. You make good things happen here. Your annual National Council gift helps us to offer exciting year-round programming, operate our campus at peak performance levels, and focus on excellence in everything we do. Thank you. So Sean, can you turn on the slide again, please? Oops. The first one, the welcome slide with everybody's names on it. That one. So this year, for our 50th anniversary, we offered a special challenge to National Council members to sponsor and support the Featured Artists and Conversation series and the Visiting Artists program. 18 of you stepped forward, named here on this screen, and led by Toby Lewis, our presenting sponsor. I'd like to thank all of you. Thank you so much. Your support enables the series to thrive, remain free of charge, and fully accessible to students and all who want to learn from the leaders in contemporary art that we bring to Anderson Ranch. Today, I'd also like to thank National Council co-chairs Erica Keswin and Karen Lord for their leadership. Through their efforts, we have 25 new National Council members so far this year. Fantastic. After today's program, we're going to head to a reception that is generously sponsored by Caroline and Howard Draft, and I'd like to thank them in advance for their generosity. And now I'd like to pass the microphone to Sue Hostetler. Sue is chair of our Art and Artists Advisory Group, and I'd like to thank Sue for her leadership. Please welcome Sue Hostetler.
Hi, thanks Nancy. It is my distinct pleasure to welcome you to a conversation between the amazing Annie Philbin, the director of the Hammer Museum at UCLA, and the incredible Charles Ray. I'm going to introduce Annie, and then Annie is going to introduce Charlie. I didn't want you to think I was giving him short shrift. I've been following Annie's career since she really transformed the little-known Drawing Center in the 1990s, and then, of course, when she was named director of the Hammer in 1999. Only the second woman in Los Angeles at a major institution to be a director there, and the only one still doing it today. Annie has expanded the Hammer's exhibition program, creating a strong and unique institutional identity while building a reputation for scholarly excellence and cutting-edge programming. She has established the Hammer as an international leader among art museums, emphasizing thematic contemporary exhibitions and artist projects that focus on under-recognized and emerging artists. I think the Hammer is really one of the only major museums today that sometimes gives artists that haven't yet had a gallery show an institutional show, which is pretty amazing in today's art world. Under Annie's leadership, the Hammer has expanded its dynamic public programs to include screenings, readings, lectures, performances, featuring many of the most provocative and creative thinkers of our time. In 2014, Annie led the Hammer as it eliminated admissions fees and increased the attendance by 25%. With Annie's direction, the museum instituted the internationally acclaimed Hammer Project series, featuring local, national, and international artists. Additionally, the Hammer conceived and launched Made in LA, a series of biennial exhibitions focused on emerging and overlooked artists in the Los Angeles area. Every one has been amazing, but the first one in 2012 was sick. It was incredible, bananas. The Hammer has organized more than 100 exhibitions and installations during Annie's tenure, many of which have traveled extensively worldwide. Annie once said, "It's not the size of the institution that's important, but what you do with the opportunities you have." It's been truly impressive watching Annie over the last 17 years take her opportunities, and to see what she has done with them has been truly amazing. Her commitment to the art world and the social and cultural impact of art is amazing and inspiring, and we are very grateful to have her here this summer. She was at the very top of our wish list. I actually thought of Annie's influence yesterday at Melva Buxbaum's memorial. Someone read a Maya Angelou quote, and it made me think of Annie. I've learned that people will forget what you said, people will forget what you did, but people will never forget how you made them feel. And I think generations of museum goers and art lovers are going to long remember Annie Philbin and her team and how they made them feel. Please help me in welcoming Annie Philbin and Charlie Ray.
Thank you, Sue. That was so nice. I see a lot of Charlie Ray fans here, so I don't need to tell you that Charlie Ray is one of the most significant and widely regarded sculptors of our time. That said, he's still somewhat under the radar. As Calvin Tompkins said in his article in The New Yorker recently, Charlie is famous but little known. It's by choice and design, of course, but it is one of the reasons that talks like this are just amazing opportunities for all of us to hear him. Charlie is unusually and remarkably articulate about his own work and the ideas that drive it, the general principles of sculpture, space, time, weight, energy, tension, and the notion of embeddedness, which is something that he is very concerned with. His most major recent exhibition was organized by the Kunstmuseum in Basel and the Art Institute in Chicago last year, and James Rondeau, the curator of it, is here with us. It represented a body of work from 1997 to 2014, which was a period of enormous creativity and productivity for Charlie. The exhibition at the Art Institute was revelatory, I mean profoundly exquisite, and it was sick. I'm going to just use it. It was, for anyone interested in art, it was truly a peak experience. If it makes you feel bad you didn't see it, there's a beautiful catalog that you should find, because it's something special. There are artists who speak about their own work, and then there are artists who speak about art. Some do it extremely well. Donald Judd was one of those, and so is Charlie. He recently did a series of talks at the Menil entitled Thoughts on Sculpture. It was 3 different talks over the course of a year, in which he shared his thoughts on Rodin, Henry Moore, Barbara Hepworth, Giacometti, Lee Bonteque, Oldenburg, and one of his favorites, David Smith. And I just want to share with you that these talks are online, and if you enjoy the talk tonight, you should really, it's worth your time. So Charlie has prepared a talk especially for this evening, and it'll focus primarily on his own work, I think, but others as well. And he'll speak for about a half an hour, then I'll ask him a few questions, and then we'll have questions from the audience. And I just want to tell you that he has a broken scapula, so if he winces in the middle of the talk, it's not because he's not enjoying being here. It's other reasons. Okay, welcome, Charlie.
Thank you. Thank you for coming to my art talk. It takes me a little while to warm up, and I usually try to get someplace a little bit and think on my feet during the process of the talk, so it's not as prepared as I would like to be. And then with the broken shoulder, I'm really kind of unprepared. But I have a direction in mind that I would like to go. And before coming here, I was thinking, well, what should I talk about? And just finishing this exhibition with James Rondeau in Chicago was, for an artist, retrospective is, you stop and think of things and listen to what other people say, and something that has always bugged me, more so in recent years, is people say, or my enemies maybe will come up to me and go, hey, I saw that show of yours in Chicago. Oh, those statues were fantastic. You go, in your mind, fucking statues. Jesus Christ. Yeah, thank you. But then the more I thought about it, I thought, well, they are statues. You know, and these people don't see, in a certain sense, they're experimental statues. And so I thought maybe a little bit of an interesting direction would be, how did a contemporary artist, the late 20th, early 21st century, come to be involved in statue making? And that was going to, you know, kind of be the progress, you know, what I wanted to talk about. I was going to start, though, with something much earlier that's not a statue or is not figurative, and maybe just has some of my concerns in it that have, in some sense, stayed with me over the years, and just sets a little bit of a foundation of Annie mentioned that I'm very concerned with embedment. No, you know, it's really interesting when you look at art words that are thrown about and used. I use that word a lot, and they're often very similar to the words used by the military. And I was kind of shocked when the Gulf Wars and stuff were going on. People were embedding journalists in you know, with troops, and it was a word that I was using and do use quite a bit. But I'd like to talk a little bit, well, what do I mean by embedded? And I guess I mean one of the hardest things for an artist, a sculptor, to do is get something into the room, get something onto the floor without you coming and going, hey, we'll put that there. How long is that going to have to be here? You know, and to give it some authority, some being there-ness with you, you know, an ability to be. For instance, the floor should not be what a sculpture sits on. The floor should be the last element of a sculpture. Right? Then it starts to, you know, flow out or vibrate out into the world. Sculpture often has problems with its boundaries. But this was a piece that I'll just briefly talk about. It's topologically complete, in that if you were an ant, you could crawl up the leg of the table and up into the bowl, down the inside of the bowl, and you'd find yourself on the underside of the table. So there are no bottoms per se. It's fused with the top surface. Right? So space itself flows in and around and through the sculpture, the still life, the kind of cotton ball jar sort of rudely puts a counterpoint to it and stops it. When this was in an earlier retrospective of mine at the Whitney, and what I remember most from that time is thinking this was the only work in that exhibition that I couldn't put in my pocket, or the viewer couldn't put in their pocket and take home. He said, oh yeah, I went to the show and saw this guy's sculpture. He, you know, painted this cube black and filled it with ink. You know, you could go and talk about these things in different ways. You know, not that you didn't have to see them, but this was, in a sense, embedded in space, where you could almost say space itself is the material of the sculpture. The world, in a sense, flows in and around and through the work. And though from here, I wanted to talk briefly about this piece from the 60s of Anthony Caro. And I think it's called Table Piece 7. Caro was working at night after working at the studio during the day, and he was making small pieces. And the problem he had in making these small pieces on tables was, to him, they always looked like they were maquettes for bigger pieces, for pieces he was working on during the day. So there we could just quickly jump back to embedment. You know, they weren't embedded. They were referring to another space, another place. They weren't embedded in space. He realized that one day that if he brought an element just over the edge of the table, that boom, it locked it into this space, into this place. And it could no longer be a reference or a marquette to a piece that he was working on during the day, per se. You know? So which seems extremely simplistic and simple. And it is extremely simple, but it's not elementary. Which I think is what is so philosophical about that move. Then we have the handle, which also has art historical references. You could think of Picasso's in the Asmus glass, the spoon element that gives scale, that makes the piece small, that gives also a kind of projected graspability. Right? You can project yourself, and I do, and I think you do to a scale of grabbing hold of that handle. But it's really fascinating not to think of that handle as just a graspable object, but as an abstract object, but even more as a spacer between two other objects, two other elements. I mean, it's a third man, there's three elements, four if you want to include the base, which one could in a way, but the handle is the different element, and it works as a kind of spacer to lock that relationship between the two pipe elements. And one can say, so what? It took me a little while in my life. These are things I've thought about and looked about a lot. But there's a kind of beautiful element to this that I want to talk about through the talk and talk about a little bit more later, that this relationship of this piece and this being, this kind of philosophical tabling, if you will, you know, you could call it a tabling. You know, it is, it's a very odd thing. It's charging almost electrically this space of this pedestal, making it almost atomic. But it is relationships that are totally outside of the viewer, outside of Caro. We don't project into them. All right? Emotionally, they're almost in a parallel space, you know, which is maybe one could, and I'm an artist, so I'm very lucky. I'm not a critic, I'm not a scholar. I can go to history and to other artists and take and borrow and think about, but I was going somewhere with that just a second ago, and I lost my track. But this kind of, maybe what I'm saying is I don't have to criticize the kind of high modernist utopian dream of this parallel space, this space outside of history, if you will, or something, you know, that I can somehow find a use for it here sculpturally. I can think I can not think about it as a sculpture. I can think into it sculpturally, in a way, is what I'm trying to say. So I want to hold on to just some of those thoughts too through the quick talk. And before I talk specifically about the sculpture, I wanted to say a few things about figuration and as the title of the talk being experimental figuration, et cetera, et cetera. We think of figuration, you think a lot of times of funky stuff, statues and parks, Greek work. We often are too close to things in our own culture that are maybe in the future, will seem different than they do now. But I, at a certain point, started getting in the late 80s, actually very interested in mannequins as a form of our culture's contemporary figuration. And they had, what role did they have in our culture? We weren't, they weren't being put in museums. We weren't thinking of them. They were lowly in a way. They were in, there was a big shift in the mannequin industry that occurred in the 50s when the post-war economic boom, the development of department stores, mannequins left papier-mâché. They left, in a certain sense, the uncanny, these people who came alive at night when the shop was closed and only had to be back before the cleaning crew came at 4, and went out dancing until the pumpkin came or whatever, No, they shifted into another function, and they didn't just become things to put clothes on. They became an idealized form. Their function, well, one, their proportions, their rules, every aspect of their figuration was written down and studied in a book called the Sears Standard. All right, so as Greeks, you've all remember from art history, 8 heads high, 3.5 wide, blah, 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 idealization, da, 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 da. Well, these were full of different kind of ideas. And their function is so you can project yourself into the figure. Right? This is what I meant a minute ago. I said the Carl is in a parallel space outside of us. It's in this tabling space. And that's what's kind of exhilarating about it. A mannequin was a figure that is designed to project your ka, your soul, into it. So it has to maintain an emptiness. Its eyes are always painted slightly out. Because if you have eye contact with the mannequin, you can no longer project into it. Right? Because it has its own spirit, no room for you. A mannequin can never smile because then again it has its spirit, and it can't be projected into. So I had gotten very interested in this mannequins as a form of figuration, and so this is not a bad figurative sculpture. It's a sculpture of a mannequin, right? Not a sculpture of a lady. I call it, and everyone calls it the big lady. So when I started working these, I tried to keep all of the mannequin conventions, all the breaks in the mannequin where they were to put the clothes on, the different sizes and proportions. I actually hired people from the mannequin industry to work for me. I wanted her at the time to be dressed like she worked for the gas company. And I bought like a $300 outfit, and it looked like a she looked like Bozo the Clown in it. So I had to buy like a $3,000 outfit. When it was blown up, it looked like a $300 outfit, in a sense, from proportions changing. And the only thing I changed with her, of course, was shifting the scale. Everything else was identical which were very important to me, the different figurative breaks, the stand, and then the function of the base of the mannequin, and which there isn't really a lot of time in this particular talk, but and I was vaguely, dimly aware of it of the time, what this figure's relationship to consumer space was. And from there now, I'll go backwards in time because I think it's a very interesting idea. Who are our mannequins today? I mean, the mannequin industry is still changing. It's not as robust as it once was. And if you go to stores now, mannequins are much more abstracted, et cetera, but, you know, are our new mannequins, you know, in our phones? Are they the Kardashians? Is jail similar to the base of the mannequin? What's connecting it to our consumer space is that bit of reality. The Kuros figure, this is the Manhattan Kuros, and 450 BC, perhaps. And it's one of my favorite figurative pieces. You can see this when you go to Manhattan, to New York at the Met. And one thing fascinating about it is we don't really know what it was like. Some scholars say, was he even read as a figure? Was it read as a post? It's very connected to its block. It's one of the first sculptures where the figure is taking a step forward into space. That's his testicles and penis. Oops. Yeah. One of the things that I find fascinating about it is how it was made in this time. 100 years later, remember, we're in classical Greek figuration. So, we're not sure how it was beheld. The scholar Richard Neer told me once, remember, Charles, it was one of the only smooth objects in an extremely rough world. They were probably votive, put in temples. They probably were also, you would be walking down some rough pitted road and come across a grove or an intersection in the road, and there'd be a row of Kuros figures. Maybe one had a similar style to one you knew of in a temple in Athens. Then a trajectory of power would come 50 miles across the countryside. You would know, who donated the one, who gave the one in Athens. That this must be his field, or part of his estates. But we're not 100% sure. A beautiful thing of the Kuros is, when you look at it, is what do you find? What I find, what I talked about a little bit on the mannequin figure is this ability today to project into it. Parts of it are realistic, parts of it are stylized due to development of a skill level, how well just the people could sculpt at that time. But what happens to me is, in looking at it, I project aspects of myself that are stylized, aspects of myself that are natural. I have to stand in front of you talking. I have to, in a certain sense, stylize aspects of myself to pull it off, to be able to seem like I have a little bit of knowledge or authority, or trick you into following along and not being bored, et cetera, et cetera. Go to a dinner, I have to know how to hold a wine or eat or have manners. Other parts, as I'm sure it happens to all of you, you're walking down the street, you look in the store window, go, oh, Jesus, it's my father. I've become him. And it's what's natural in you. You can't, that there is no escape. Well, here at this period in the Kuros, there's this kind of dance of relationship through the surface of what's stylized and what's, and not just through, I think through a kind of intentionality in thinking about what they're doing, but not the way I'm talking about it today. The meaning of it, and it's something I want to talk about just a little bit. It's meaning, and many people will disagree with me, but it's the first thing that gets blown away in the fire hose of time. And what are you left with after we don't know what the hell it meant anymore? You're left with what's artful about it. And so this kind of orchestration of its sculpturalness, of its making, is what is, to me, so intriguing. And, you know, Richard Neer again said, I said, why is it so contemporary? Why can I be so involved with it today? He said, because you can still see it. There's a beautiful aspect that I find so artful. Again, he's stepping forward into space. Where is he going? An adolescent into manhood, the archaic into the classic? Is he trying to get to us, to the future? He never quite makes it to our age, so we too kind of have to step towards him. Sculpture has this problem of, Michelangelo once said, a good sculpture, you should be able to roll it down the hill and the arms and legs won't break off of it. All right? But you can see the sculpture here is dealing with that. To see this connection between the thigh and the arm is left solid. To give the, so the arms won't break off at the joint. But if you look close, what did the sculptors do is they also show that here, because it's solid, but they don't leave it flat. They give it like a little bit of a push, like a water balloon. So the figure not only has a strange smile, but he has intentionality. The hands are ever so slightly squeezing. All right? He has an internal dimension that's sculpted. He has testicles that are going to seed the world. And their breath, their pneuma is just, I find it, with all the pneuma and the inflatables going on in the contemporary world today, you look at those and you go, Jesus, God, man. I mean, it's so fertile. But not out of relationship to what's happening here with that bulge. And so from there, I jumped to something that got kind of humorously a work of mine that, or not humorous would be the wrong word, but endearingly called the Venice Beach Kuros. And it was a work that took me 10 years, and I just almost like a blank canvas wanted to make a figure, naked figure, no props, nothing, just, it would be right out in front that it's art, it's just a figure, not holding anything funny, doesn't have a flag or a dildo in its hand, doesn't, push you that way or this way, and see if I could sculpt this person who I knew really well, named, it was a student of mine. And then, after many years, he was no longer a student. And I spent so much time working on it and so many years that I started thinking about things while I was working on it. I won't go into all the sculptural aspects of it, but that I didn't make it. I'm totally responsible for it. But I am not, an age or a time made it. Time itself, given enough time, time made it. It was many different patterns, many different materials. It was in the computer, out of the computer. It was polychromed. It just, once had a chicken running around by his foot. And I and my team and people, my assistants and people with me, spent many hours just sort of thinking about it and looking at it and trying to find a relationship between, a toenail bed and a lip. And I once turned to Sylvia Gaspardo-Moro, my wife, and said, I don't even think, after a number of years, this stuff is just too subtle. It's not, no one's ever going to be able, do you think anyone's ever going to be able to see any of this? And she said, no, they won't. But the meaning is in the subtleties. And I then just had this kind of courage, just keep going. And we eventually, I remember once when I was in plaster for a long time, we were making decisions and looking at it so your eye would never go into it and get like a doughboy, but would not slide off of it. And eventually, machine files were created, and it was carved in solid steel. In a way, I thought, to, it's 1,300 pounds, to allow it to go, to tumble away from my authorship and to, not my responsibility, that's an important distinction there, but to tumble off into time and find its own relationship to the world somehow. And I think because I spent so much time on these details and I allowed, when I say it made itself, I just waited until by chance almost, or what felt like it was by chance, the right decisions came before our eyes. So, oh no, make the nail bed harder. This is too graphic, make that less. No, make it more again. Until all of a sudden, just not one thing at a time, but kind of all at once, it just started to slowly find itself in a way. And it's called Young Man. And I tried to, as the Kyros is squeezing and stepping and full of vitality in this kind of quiet, restrained way, I tried to find a way to animate also, but the only way I knew how, through my understanding of this guy, who was a very California guy, a very LA guy kind of, and I tried to, without being obvious or overblown about it or characterizing about it, sculpt his ka, if you will, let his soul kind of come up and out onto the surface. And I think because of those things, it became truly the most abstract sculpture that I ever made. And it was interesting because he could really hold his ground in a space. And this, I'm going to speed up a little bit so we can have our questions and stuff. This is a grave stele from Athens of a young girl kissing a bird. It's all in relief. And here, except for between the lips and the beak. And here I want to go back a little bit to the Carl sculpture. And I talked about that charged energy, the tabling. I'm not talking about the space underneath the handle. Don't mistake it. It's not a graphic, visual thing like that. But another quieter outsideness. I know birdsong and pneuma and breath are internal. We feel them and have feelings about them. Yet this space, you can almost hold it. It is so philosophically charged. I believe like a particle physicist could study this sculpture and meditate on that space. And so I don't know where I am or what I'm talking about 100%, but something I'm trying to go and think about these days is there anything to do? It's an old philosophical question also. Where's meaning? Is it inside? Or is it and just correlated to the outside? Or is it outside? Can we turn ourselves inside out and find it? So anyway, I see, and I can't quite articulate because it's a sculptural idea, not a verbal idea, but something in this relief, and Carl's tabling. There's something so beautiful about the sculpture's ability to understand that three-dimensional space is the most three-dimensional space I've ever felt, only because it's in a kind of relationship between the relief itself, because there is no real space here. This is rendered space. And then to bring it there, it makes it all that much more you know, I mean, it's just so charged. Like this, like whatever it is that's happening on the base. So, of the choral work. So, you know, I'm trying to connect in this, my own sculptural thought, and it's, again, inarticulate at this point, but this high modernist utopian idea with this, I see it here, this archaic artfulness of giving us, handing us space, you know, which is, you know, I mean, space, what is it? Nobody knows. And this was a piece that the Whitney Museum wanted me to make for their new building. And I thought, I'll just go really quick and then Annie and I can talk. What could I do that for the outside that would really be appropriate? I thought, you know, the full name of the Whitney is the Whitney Museum of American Art. And I went back to this moment in Twain when Huck and Jim are having this debate on the river's edge at dawn or at night, and Jim thinks that the stars were made, Huck thinks that they always were. And, you know, then Huck says to Jim, well, if they always, how does it go? If they was made and weren't always, who made them? And Jim said the moon laid them. And then Huck is thinking, he said, well, you know, I once saw a frog lay her eggs. And so I reckon it could be true, you know, that they could, you know, the moon could lay this infinite amount of stars. It's this sort of beautiful moment. Chapter 13. If you go read it, it's much better than I just made it. So here, I saw a kind of animal. In my mind for the Whitney, saw 4 legs like a beast. And you know, they were naked because, you know, as Huck said, we had no need for clothes, no how, anyway. You know, they were on the river. And Huck is lost in this boyhood moment, scooping up spermosa of a frog out of the river bottom. And Jim is looking out almost like Moses going to part the Red Sea. He sees the implication, you know, in a much more anxious way than Huck. And you know, if I was to title this talk, it would be Experimental Statues or the Space Between Jim's Hand and Huck's Back. And I'm thinking a lot about the bird song, the breath and the bird beak and the tabling space of the Caro. And when you see there, it's an uneasy, it's not a cupping of his hand on the cup of the back. It's a much more uneasiness, you know. It's a different kind of space. It's a very metered space as well. And you could find the recent history is this is the pattern of the sculpture. Sculpture wasn't, Whitney didn't want to put it up because of the nakedness of the black guy and the white boy. And this is at the retrospective in Chicago. With James and I put it here. That's very metered and kind of, you know, so I talked a little bit about, and I'm going to leave it with this, with the table, a spatial embedment that is locked. The world flows through that table in that place, you know, and it's locked in place there, almost like a lock and key. With the young man, I talked about, he's embedded spatially, but also temporally. I wanted him to like tumble away from me and tumble into time. And I've been thinking lately as well started with this piece and another piece, could one use politics or civicness sculpturally as a form also of embedment? Could something be so locked also in a place or a city that it can't be removed sculpturally. And there are, examples of that. There's these huge problems with graffiti, et cetera, and one day I think I realized that it's not about anti-graffiti coatings, not about guards. It's just about courage. You make something that has a form that's strong enough. And I don't know any real example, not to keep people from painting it, but to keep existing despite the vandalism. But anyway, I'll leave it here, and we can, so we have time for questions and stuff. We still have time? Yeah.
Perfect. Yeah, we're good. Perfect, actually.
Good.
Yeah.
Yeah, good.
That was good.
Thank you.
Who said that thing to you about the horse and rider? What would happen to it over years? That was good.
My art dealer.
Matthew.
Matthew Marks. I have this piece called Horse and Rider. And he said, he was trying to just, tell me to relax. He said, well, it looks really great. He said it will look really, really great the day you put it out. And this is unguarded. He goes, and then it will start looking really bad. And he goes, it will look really, really horrible for 40 years, when people graffiti it and key it and everything. He goes, and then it will start looking pretty good again after 40 years. So you just have to have courage. But I think he has a point.
One of the things that I heard you talk about in the Menil talks was the notion of the best sculptures being unpossessable. And I thought that was really interesting because you talked about David Smith and Bonteque and Giacometti versus, and it was kind of a versus, Barbara Hepworth and a couple of others. But the point was that there are some pieces you feel you can put in your pocket, you said, and take home and talk about them. And then there are others that are simply unpossessable, and those are the ones that you're interested in. So talk about that a little bit, and how do you strive for that? Because it's clearly not something tangible.
Well, I think you cannot strive for those things, or you sort of see them, and I'm trying to get to this unpossessable thing. Exactly what I meant. I thought I had it for a second. I can't quite 100% remember what I was trying to drive at that. Maybe it's something I've been thinking about lately, about some art or authorship is more an index than but anyway, what you're trying to say, I don't know. If I talk a little bit about Smith, and that came out of a lecture I did on holes in sculpture. And there was a moment I was talking about Hepworth and Moore, and then Smith's piece to Becca, I think, or Becca Day, maybe it was. And Smith works in a very shallow space, super shallow with plates. And he worked on the floor, actually, and then later would lift them up. And there's a hole in his, if you will, and Becca Day, and you see landscape through it, but it's never like a frame. It's like the sculpture itself has digested the landscape. And one day I had this thought, well, if I grabbed my cell phone and threw it, it would hit that space and bounce off. But if I threw it at the hole of more, it would just sail right through, in a way. And it's not.
So it's similar to the space between Huck and Jim's back and his hand, in the sense that it's all about that space. That space is.
It's very. I don't know. I mean, the whole thing about the holes, and this will get back to what you're saying, it wasn't really a lecture on sculpture with holes in it. Holes were just a way to talk about great sculpture which is made out of space, which, you know, some philosophers think the world's made out of space, you know, that that's the mosaic, a space-time mosaic, and it's little curled up events happening on it. But, you know, it's another thing. You don't even have to think that way. That's not what I mean by sculptural space. But yeah, I mean, that space of Smith, I won't say it's timeless, because it isn't, but it's unpossessable in that it's maybe more back to what I was saying initially on the Carl tabletop piece. It gets to be outside of you. You know, it's not something you can take home.
Right.
You know, it's you know, figurative sculpture is really interesting, you know, because it's so primitive in a way. You know, and primitive meaning like basic. You know, like philosophically primitive is like, well, we can't talk about it anymore because we're at the primitive level. You can't. There's no more parts or something. And then, you know, it's just sort of an interesting aside, but it got me. I was thinking about this the other night, and I just did a quick research on figure ground because of figuration. And, you know, I never saw until yesterday the arrow on the FedEx logo. Do you know it? Mm-hmm. Yeah, I never saw that. So anyway, that kind of basic. But figuration and these topics have that. They're very... So that's kind of unpossessable, the kind of, I think, externalness. Right. I mean, how can you ever possess it? Once you possess it, it's internal.
The matter of factedness, which has been talked about, I don't know if that's even a word, but the matter of factness of
Yes.
your sculptures, and especially in, for example, the way you depict genitals, and so the aluminum girl, the pronounced labia, the penises. I mean, I think that's an interesting thing that you were talking about how can you make something that becomes so matter of fact? How can you make a sculpture and put it outdoors that becomes so embedded in its space that it becomes welcomed and not graffitied and not harmed? How can you make the depiction? Why do contemporary sculptures have that disturbance around sexuality, whereas the Kouros doesn't? Like how is that an issue for you when you think about when people look at your work?
Well, maybe there is a little bit of the matter-of-factness because they are just what they are. And you know, my history, maybe a couple of different things. You know, going to military school or whatnot. When you're going through the puberty thing, you just had to be naked, and you know, with taking showers, and lived in a room with a lot of kids. So there was just a matter-of-factness about all that kind of stuff. And then the kind of maybe a little bit of the high modernist training was like, you know, you don't make sculpture about any of that kind of stuff, you know, or you don't make sculptures about your girlfriends or boyfriends or, you know, what makes you upset or something, you know. It's just, you know, so, I mean, they are matter of fact. It's just, you know, there's a stiffness to it, maybe.
But Huck and Jim still can't be outside.
I think they could. Yeah, I think they can.
So it's about someone.
But do you, I mean, there was so much talk about it at that time, that, which is fine, but all that, I'm responsible for the piece. All right, so everything about Huck and Jim, the controversy, all that, it's my responsibility in a way. It's not my artfulness about it, though. You know, it's as a result of it, and I think, you know, in the proper time, the proper place, you know, it will. I'm still working on the piece. This is still the pattern, And my interest in it is much more, I mean, it isn't apolitical by any means at all, but, you know, I'm interested in it as a sculpture. Mm-hmm. And, you know, it has to be born, a sculpture isn't born neutered, it's born alive. There's a lot going on. And so, I mean, it comes into the world, it's kicking, it's screaming, it's, you know, spitting. People are trying to, like, get it to breathe and, you know, get it, you know, settled down and everything. And so, you know, the game's over if it's stillborn, you know, and everybody, ah, yeah, great, yeah, how much I owe you? You know, then it's like, you know, so, but it's interesting. You know, the bigger picture, the longer, deeper picture is, you know, we don't know what the Kuros was about, mm-hmm. and it's still so mm-hmm. engaging sculpturally because mm-hmm. It was, you know, made as a sculpture.
Mm-hmm. You have a thing about ghosts. Not that you necessarily believe in them, but they seem to come up for you. Whether you're talking about the ghost of the person who died in the wrecked car, or the ghost of Rodin being in his sculpture, or it's
the
something...
figuration of the shoe type.
Exactly.
On the cover of the cow.
Exactly. So, and I understand you actually tell your students ghost stories.
Not always, but... Ghost stories are interesting because I see them as you know, if we could ever prove or disprove ghosts, we would lose a beautiful thought experiment, right? Because they're really about living. And they're about many things. They're about many, many, many different things. And I was reading Plino, you know Plino, his letters? I was reading the other night the Roman writer, and Book 7, and I forget his friend. I can't pronounce everything in it, but there's a beautiful ghost story. And there's this house in Athens that has a terrible reputation. And the people who lived in it over the years, they would see at night, they would hear, like in the distance, like metal banging against metal. And then the more attuned ones would start hearing in the deep distance chains. Right? And then eventually a figure would enter the room with fettered feet and chained hands and just scare the bejesus out of these people and scare them so bad that people got disease and died, not from fright that night, but by the reoccurrence of this apparition. And they couldn't sleep during the day, so their immune systems wore out or whatever, because they were so terrified of going home at night. So eventually, the house was just abandoned, but it was in a really good neighborhood in Athens. This is in his letter, his very, very beautiful letter. And it was put up for sale and also for lease, and very cheaply. You know, because everybody knew about it. It was in a great neighborhood, but no one wanted it because of its reputation. And this philosopher, Thoros, I can't pronounce his name, so I won't try, but he comes to town from Persia or somewhere, and he's looking for a place to stay, and he hears about this house. And he says, well, my God, it's cheap. And it's such a big place. You know, why is it so cheap? So the realtor, they had realtors back then, tells them, well, the story. He says, I'll take it. So he puts all his people, his helpers, and the people he travels with in the back rooms, and he takes the center room. And he brings his lamp, and he lights his lamp, and he gets to work. Why does he go to work? Because he knows, like we all know, idle minds see things. And why does he light his lamp? So he can write, but also to dispel the shadows. And in the middle of the night, he starts hearing, but he just ignores the sound of metal. And he hears some more, and then this apparition appears before him, and there's this old man in chains. And he just says, I'm busy, wait. And the guy's rattling his chain. The philosopher's continuing to write. He goes, okay, all right, I'm done. And this ghost floats out to the courtyard, and the philosopher follows him. And he disappears behind some rosemary bushes. And the next day, the philosopher gets the magistrate, and people says, dig. And they dig, and they find a body buried there in chains and fetters. And they realize that he was improperly buried. He was killed, which happened in those times, by his host for his gold. And no one ever bothered that house again because they buried him properly. All right? So what is this about? It's real estate. It's about disclosure, even back then. And I read another commentary later about this, and it was, as it is today, a realtor's job to disclose. So do you disclose, for instance, there's a big difference if someone was murdered in a living room 10 years ago or an old man died last week in the upstairs bedroom. It means something to people. So it's about disclosure laws. And a realtor doesn't have to tell you that someone died or was murdered in the house unless asked. New York had a case a few years ago where it's a murder, and it went, so the guy said, hey, this place is haunted, I'm out of here, sale invalid. It went all the way to the state Supreme Court. The state Supreme Court said no. He did not ask the realtor if the house was haunted, if there had been a murder. The realtor did not have to disclose. But the sale is invalid because during escrow, it was still occupied. This is like within the last 10 years. So anyway, there are in ghost stories like really complex and interesting reasons for them, and they're great aids, and they're figurative in a way. They're another form of figuration.
Absolutely. I've been given the signal. It's time for questions and answers here. So you have to please wait for the microphone to get to you.
Charles, I saw an extraordinary sculpture you made at the Rails collection that was outdoor that appeared to be of a toy model tractor with an individual sitting on it. Would you be able to tell us anything about that particular work in whatever way you want to have us understand your thinking about it or your feelings about it?
Well, like all things that has stories to it that are relevant and not, maybe meaningful and unmeaningful, it's the first solid machine piece that I made. Weighs 18 tons. And I was working in New Jersey on another piece, another tractor, aluminum tractor. I was having a great deal of trouble. And the foundry was going bankrupt, closing its doors. I was looking, I was an emotional wreck. And everybody was losing money. I was losing money. We were trying to keep it in production, but life was falling apart. And as a kind of a joke gift, Kiki Smith gave me this toy of that figure on the tractor. It was about this big, just to cheer me up one day. But I kept it around a long time and kept looking at it. And it had some very interesting qualities to it. I'm very intrigued by Assyrian reliefs and how the figures are rendered. And I was intrigued by that rendering of that guy. Anyway, to make a long story short, I had the idea, sort of a rebirth of my pain of making the other tractor. And I thought, we'll just scan it, machine it. Well, there was a lot of trouble. As we scanned it, then, it looked, when you were going to blow it up, it looked like soap or something. Then we fixed it, and it looked like a Star Wars toy. So it went through a lot of different manifestations to get it to where it would look like it does today. And anyway, but the interesting thing about it, I think, one is the father figure on it, but man and machine in a way. It's weight that you only sense because it's painted like the toy. But I titled it initially Outdoor Sculpture because I thought it should be an indoor sculpture, but because of its great weight and mass, it would carry the entire upstate New York with it. So it would bring all of Bolton Landing, would kind of drag inside with it because it was, you know, so massive. And then the Rails saw that was, while I was working on it, that the working title was Outdoor Sculpture, and then they asked Matthew, well, could we put it outside? And then I said, well, you know, title is Outdoor Sculpture, why not? It's destined to go back indoors, though. But then that gave me the idea to name it Father Figure, which is a nicer title, because, you know, you never quite know who your father is. Just like that guy, I think you don't quite know who he is. You know, is he WPA, or is he, you know, Mongolian from the 30s? What, you know, I mean, you can't quite identify. And his gesture of how he's turned, his body's forward, but he's totally turned and almost like part of the machine. But anyway, thank you.
I don't want to sound aggressive here, but I want to go back to Huck and Jim. So I have a two-part question. You know, given Rudy Giuliani and the right-wing politicians in Washington we love so much, and pedophilia scandals and race relations, did you honestly think that this would fly on the public plaza outside the museum? And then the second part is, it was my understanding that the Whitney offered to put this on private space just inside the glass enclosed lobby.
They did.
And that you did not think that was a good idea.
Yeah, they did. They did, because
you had said you didn't. They didn't want it.
If it ever ends up somewhere like that, in a semi-public, semi-private place, it's a different story. It was its moment of birth, right? It was built around this plaza outside, and I actually rented a room twice as big as this to build it in, to sense that plaza and get the scale right and all this stuff. I thought the controversy, and in my proposal, it's spoken of, that it would, I wasn't, and I think I forget the exact words I used, not so naive to think there would be no controversy we didn't have to get through with it, but it would be like getting through a forest that eventually we would. And yeah, so, you know. So why not have it in the lobby then? Because it's not the plaza where it was designed for. I don't want to begin with a compromise. You know, you might end up one day somewhere else, something happens, but it's again embedment. I don't want it, you know, I didn't want it to begin that way. They also said it could be on the terraces upstairs, outside. But that's not on the ground level, the level of the river, the level of the people, the level of the city, the level of the, you know, there's later in Huck and Jim, they're downriver, and the game's almost up. Bounty hunters are quite on top of them. And Huck is thinking, geez, you know, here I am, Miss Watson. She never did me no harm. She just gave me schooling, just made me wear clothes, just dressed me up a bit. But she was a good lady, all in all. But here I am, stealing her property, helping steal her property. Never once did Huck question the institution of slavery. And he says in the book, he goes, but you know what? So what then? Fuck it. I'll go to hell, but I won't turn him in. So Huck makes a decision in his psyche that rather than turn Jim in, he'll create a, you know, he'll live in sin, stealing the property, which he doesn't, you know, question slavery itself, you know. And so it's tied to that to me a little bit, you know, at the beginning. Like if that is what Huck thought, how could I say, okay, yeah, let's put it in the cafeteria? I couldn't.
Charlie, do you, now that some time has passed, so what do you feel the Whitney, what's your feeling about that decision?
Oh, of what? The Whitney?
Yeah.
Well, it's not my decision, it's their decision. And
but was there a broken I mean, the relationship between the artist who makes this commissioned work and the museum?
Maybe some friends and some scholars thought that I should like been more vocal and pissed off and forced it somehow.
But how do you really feel about that? I mean,
well, like
should a public museum, should a museum, how far should a museum go to stand up for the artist?
It's not a question of that. It's not a question of the museum. It's a bigger question. It's a much bigger question. I mean, my friend Frank Gehry was doing the Eisenhower Memorial. He called me up and said, would you do, because he saw Boy with Frog and really liked it. He said, would you do Ike as a junior for me? I said, man, I'm not going to do that. I go, I'm waiting for the MacArthur Commission. That's a much more complex guy. And I said, and you know what, Frank? Be really careful. Don't mention my name 500 miles near Washington, D.C., or we'll all be sorry. So he goes there, and they say, well, who's going to do the statue? Oh, my friend Charles Ray. And I can't tell you the kind of right-wing conservative feedback and lies and blogs and stuff written about me, right? That in Boy with Frog, I took body molds. Needless to say, there had to be a mighty big boy to take body molds. And just as you can imagine, the this, the that, the this, the that. It's a much bigger issue than whatever. That to me is the Whitney's business. And it's I don't hold a grudge about it at all.
Away from politics for a minute. Back to the Jim and Huck sculpture. What does the space between his hand and Huck's back represent?
That's it. That's the perfect question, and maybe it's a good one to end on in a way, because you use a word there that's really, really important, and that word was represent. What does it represent? And it represents, as a sculptor, absolutely nothing. But I'm not telling you it can't represent something to you, something to the Whitney, something to the conservative. That's their, that's it being born into the world, kicking and screaming and peeing and fighting for its position. To me, the void, that space, like when I talk about Carl realizing if I put the edge of the element over the table, it's here in this place now. It doesn't mean anything. It is a phenomena. It is a verb. It's something you can pick up and hold and will generate. It will generate meaning. It's a factory to create meaning. And so that's where I am. Like, is that, to your question, I don't want to belittle it and say like, oh, I won't own up that this should be, a thing that the Whitney should have done or shouldn't have done, or that I was so naive that you could have a white boy bending over, a black guy behind him. But so what? I mean, there are all kinds of relationships going on that are purely sculptural, and that's where my job is. And as things are being born, I mean, I go and I spend hours, every time in New York with the curos, just wondering about why these relationships are still so powerful what can I learn from them that is so meaningful, And it's not meaning that came down 4,000 years. Meaning didn't march down on a horse that far. It's the sculpture that came. The meanings, like I said, the Kyril's figure, he's stepping forward, but we have to step towards him too, So, I don't know. Hope I answered your question.
It's a privilege to hear you talk, Charlie. Thank you. You're amazing. You were amazing. Really good. Thank you. Really good.